Everybody, I'm Dean Cohen. I want to welcome you to the Dean Speaker Series here at SAIS. I always enjoy these events. Today, though, it's a particular pleasure because I'm welcoming somebody who's been a friend for many years and with whom I had the great privilege of working in government. This is retired Ambassador to NATO, retired Lieutenant General Doug Lute. General Lute had a very distinguished career in the United States Army for 35 years, including serving as the Director of Operations at Central Command, and then the Director of Operations on the Joint Staff. He was then plucked from that by President George W. Bush in 2007 to become the Deputy National Security Advisor for Afghanistan and Iraq. Remarkably, he was continued in that role by President Obama. So he had really the unique experience of serving under two presidents, very different administrations, very different outlooks, for 6 years, being the chief person at the White House in charge of the running of the Afghanistan war and also Iraq. So we're going to be talking about Afghanistan, but we'll be talking about many other things as well. So Doug, if you would turn on your video and your microphone.
Great.
There you are.
I'm here.
It is truly great to have you with us. So welcome to SAIS. I wish it was physically, but we'll make do with this. Everybody, the way I'll be running these the way I always do, which is to say about half an hour back and forth with General, what am I supposed to call you? Ambassador, General?
Let's go with Doug.
Let's go with Doug. Okay. Let's go with, I'll go with Doug for about half an hour, and then I'll take questions. Please put questions in the Q&A. My experience is that tends to get kind of crowded. So the sooner you put them in, the better, and we'll just take it from there. And I guess what I should say is that from 2007 to 2008, it really was a privilege to work with Doug. I was the counselor of the State Department. My portfolio was chiefly Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we were in pretty constant contact, including a number of quite memorable trips on a rather regular basis out to both countries, which there are memories from that'll stick with both of us, I dare say. So Doug, let me begin. Actually, I'm curious, there you were happily working on the Joint Staff as the Director of Operations. Actually, why don't you explain to everybody what the Director of Operations does on the Joint Staff? And I thought I'd just walk people a bit through your career here.
Yeah, sure. So the Director of Operations, or as they call them, the J3, right? So Joint Staff 3 is the director who oversees the deployment of military forces worldwide, and in particular in our system, the allocation of resources, so ships, planes, troops, and so forth, to the combatant commands. So everybody's familiar with CENTCOM, Central Command. At the time that I was the Director of Operations in 06, 07, CENTCOM had the major demand signal on worldwide resources. So here, think about carrier strike groups, think about brigade combat teams of ground forces, or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, all of which are limited in availability and have to be allocated against a priority. And at that time, in 06 and 07, when I was there at the Joint Staff, the Director of Operations really sort of was fueling CENTCOM. I mean, the task here essentially was to keep as many resources as it could in the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. In civilian terms, I suppose the J3 is sort of like a COO of a big corporation.
Yeah, and your previous career, you're a West Point graduate. You made the mistake of going to the Kennedy School rather than SAIS
Where, by the way, so just for your listeners, I took a course by Sam Huntington, and Eliot Cohen was his teaching assistant. So the Harvard experience was really the beginning of our relationship.
Yeah, it really was. Your background in the Army was armored cavalry. So how did you end up getting tapped by President Bush to move from the Joint Chiefs of Staff into the White House?
Right. So this story really begins in '06 when the situation in Iraq had deteriorated significantly and was verging on sectarian-based civil war. And this began in early '06 with the bombing the Summer of Hamas, but escalated. This intersectarian violence escalated throughout '06, leading Bush to take a very decisive, make a decisive decision to surge 5 additional U.S. brigade combat teams. So think sort of 15 to 20,000 additional troops into Iraq against the advice of all his uniformed military advisors. So from the commander in Iraq through the Central Command commander through the Joint Chiefs, everybody advised against surging additional U.S. troops. Bush refuted that advice, decided to surge, and in January of '07, made the speech to the nation that announced this military move. As part of this surge, he made some leadership changes. He changed out the commander in Iraq, Dave Petraeus, became the 4-star commander in Iraq. He changed out the ambassador, Ryan Crocker, became our ambassador in Iraq, and the troops began to flow. The troops, basically, these additional troops flowed from January, February into sort of June, July. And in the course of this, Steve Hadley, who was a national security advisor, and President Bush decided that they needed someone in the West Wing, someone in the White House, who could every day keep the president and Steve informed about progress in Iraq. And not only the flow of troops, but political progress, economic assistance, regional concerns, and so forth. So they put out a sort of a job offering for someone to take this job. No one wanted this job. And I soon, after being picked, figured out why no one wanted this job. But I became the guy who, on a daily basis, briefed the president. So the routine was 6 days a week, 7 o'clock in the morning. Bush would walk from the residence over to the Oval Office, yell my name because he knew I was waiting in the sort of the outer Oval Office, and I would get my 5 or 10 minutes of briefing in terms of overnight events in Iraq. But that's the kind of coordinator role that I played that eventually led to you and I being connected, because Condi Rice gave you a similar role at state to sort of oversee these two conflict areas.
Yeah. So now, as I recall, you were against the surge initially, weren't you?
I was, yeah. I was part of the sort of uniformed military so the uniformed military advice not to commit additional U.S. troops, but rather to put the onus on Iraqi forces to stem the sectarian violence.
So was it tough going to work for somebody who just overruled not only your advice, but the advice of everybody who wore the same set of clothes to work?
So it was I felt a little uncomfortable, obviously, because I'm interviewing for this job to oversee the surge, essentially, and knowing that the president had approved the surge himself. And in the course of the interview process, I eventually made my way to a session one-on-one with President Bush. So we're seated there in a sort of iconic setting in front of the fireplace in the Oval Office, and he's very generous and very, sort of outgoing, asked me about my background and all that sort of thing. And in the course of that, I slipped in the mention that, Mr. President, I didn't favor the surge. I was part of the resistance movement, I suppose. And he said, I didn't actually know that, but I love you for telling me, which kind of set us, I think, on a good standing from the outset. But he never,
speaks well of him, doesn't it?
I'm sorry?
It speaks well of him, doesn't it?
It does. And likewise, I never detected, after he took this decision in opposition to the uniformed military advice, I never detected any sort of lingering animosity or doubt on either party, either on behalf of the president or on behalf of his military team. So I thought it was a really good example of, look, you can debate issues, but at some point the debate ends, the decider decides, in this case, the president, and then everybody salutes and moves on in a professional way. And I thought it was professional on both sides.
So what I want to do is I'm going to work us eventually to President Biden's recent decision, but
Sure.
just to kind of continue on the march there, I think over time it's fair to say more and more of your focus shifted to Afghanistan, right?
Well, as Iraq stabilized, so the second half of '07 and clearly into '08, culminating in '08 after Obama wins the '08 election. In the period between the election and Obama's inauguration, Bush and Prime Minister Maliki actually signed the Strategic Framework Agreement and essentially the Status of Forces Agreement, which allowed for U.S. forces to stay in Iraq for another 3 years. So from the end of '08 to the end of '11. So both on the sort of physical security front, but also on the political front, there was significant progress in that last 18 months of the Bush administration. As progress was made in Iraq, meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, it was clear that the Taliban had sort of refound their footing. And this was actually, I think this probably began in about '06. The Taliban began to resurge and regather itself, reorganize itself. Meanwhile, the Afghan government had made little progress on corruption, little progress on delivery of services and benefits to the Afghan people, little really governance at all outside of the large population centers. And the combination of those factors, little governance and resurgent Taliban, were very closely interconnected. So things began to deteriorate more obviously in Afghanistan. Quite honestly, if we had been paying closer attention, maybe if we hadn't paid so much attention to Iraq, we might have detected this resurgence in Afghanistan sooner. But as it is by '08, I think '08 featured one or more of our trips into the region, and the trip reports coming out of our visits to Afghanistan are quite clear in spelling out this sort of deterioration of the security situation and the absence of good governance.
So this actually, I would like you to talk a little bit about the trips, not just, they bring back memories of
Sure.
you and I having various adventures, but it really did strike me as something in innovation, because usually senior people supporting the top decision makers don't usually go wandering off to these areas for a week or two at a time.
Yeah.
They might fly to Capitol and talk to the president or a prime minister or foreign minister,
Right.
or defense minister, but you really led us doing something different. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about that.
Well, first I have to tell our colleagues this morning about a funny story, right? So on one of these trips, so we took a government plane to Kabul, landed there, and then we took a small sort of regional plane around to different sites around Afghanistan. And our trips always sort of featured this attempt to get out of the capital and out of the palaces and so forth, and out and sort of get ourselves dusty. So in one of these dusty ventures, we went to Farah province, which is the far southwestern province bordering Iran in Afghanistan. And on the way out there, I remember talking to you, Elliot, across kind of the aisle in this small regional airplane saying, we're headed out to the edge of empire. This is as far as America reaches, right? So we're going to go to Farah. So the plane lands, dusty dirt airstrip, dust settles, ramp comes down, the 3 or 4 of us on the trip come down the ramp, and we're greeted by a small party of Americans who were there as part of the provincial reconstruction team in Farah province. So, 2 or 3 civilians, 2 or 3 military. One of the greeting party come running up to greet us, holding something in his hand. Well, it was a copy of Supreme Command by Eliot Cohen. And the first order of business for this young PRT officer was to get Eliot's signature on Supreme Command. I thought, my God, if Supreme Command has found its way all the way out to Farah province, that really speaks to the reach of Eliot Cohen and Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
But, I found, I think partly the way we sort of got into these pattern of trips was my experience as the CENTCOM operations officer under John Ambassador. So from '04 to '06, I was the operations officer for CENTCOM. John Abizade was the four-star commander, and his pattern for a given month would be to spend 3 weeks forward in our forward headquarters in Doha, Qatar, 1 week back in Tampa at the main headquarters. In the 3 weeks in region, we would use Doha as sort of a hub and then go out to different parts of the CENTCOM area of responsibility. So a day or two in Iraq, a day or two in Afghanistan, down to the Horn of Africa, up into Central Asia, and so forth. And what I found during these trips with Abizade was just the power of getting beyond the written reports, getting beyond the intelligence reports, and talking to people on the ground who have a texture. They understand the fabric, the texture of these problems in a way that you don't get typically from your desk in either CENTCOM headquarters or, it turns out, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House. So when given the opportunity to sort of replicate this pattern from the White House, it was sort of natural. So we picked up David Gordon, also from State, Jim Shin, Mary Beth Long from the Pentagon, and we formed a little interagency team. One of the intentional but not always appreciated values of trips like this is that the team really bonds in the course of these trips, because there are hardships, planes are late, weather intervenes, and so forth, right? And the team, we became fast friends. And I think the five of us are fast friends to this day, largely founded on those trips. But it was the fabric. It was gaining the texture of the problem that I found most valuable from those trips.
Yeah, I would say, I think Secretary Rice would agree that, because I would, of course, do an elaborate debrief after the trips. And I think it was a very different perspective than she was getting actually from the embassy or the Bureau. So, okay, let's move this along. At the very end of 2008, we were working on a Afghan strategy review. I think it's correct to say that all of us had a darker view of Afghanistan than we had come in with. As I recall, the CIA had a particularly dark view. The embassy was a little bit more optimistic. We drafted, and this was basically as a sort of a handoff to our successors.
It was part of the transition process from Bush to Obama.
So how did President Obama end up asking you to stay on? Well, I mean, that was unusual, right?
Well, I think it was, yeah. I mean, it's not typical for senior staffers in the National Security Council, especially at the assistant to the president level, to be asked to make the transition with the president. But in my case, it was perhaps a little less unusual because I was still on active duty as a military officer. So I didn't have Republican or Democratic credentials. I just had Army credentials. So I think that helped. I think the thing that actually made it possible, however, was the naming of General Jim Jones as Obama's national security advisor. So Jones, quite unexpected, was asked to be the national security advisor. And as he looked at his National Security Council staff, he quickly appreciated that there wasn't going to be much continuity there. And in fact, all of the senior directors, all of the senior staff across the NSC were going to depart on January 20th, on Inauguration Day. And yet he had inherited, and Obama had inherited, these two wars, right? Iraq and Afghanistan are still ongoing. So because I knew Jim from previous military assignments, especially in European Command when he was the 4-star NATO commander, it was not that big a reach for him to ask me and my team to stay on. And I had a great team. I mean, Brett McGurk was on my team. Alyssa Slotkin, now the congresswoman from Michigan 8th District, was on my team. Rich Hooker, Doug Ollivant, a counterinsurgency expert. So we had really assembled a good, I think, highly functional team. And we had this reputation in part because of these trips. We had this reputation of being able, from the National Security Council, to reach out to our counterpart teammates in state, defense, and so forth, And I think in part because we had a positive reputation for cooperation and open collaboration, Jones asked us to stay on. So we did. Now, I imagined, okay, decent interval, right? I mean, maybe you stay on for 6 months or something, but, they're not going to keep me on forever. We ended up spending 4.5 years in the White House under Obama.
So I think, I mean, this is really quite unique. I mean, and you've, as you know, I've been nagging you ever since to write a book, because really, there's nobody else out there who's had that experience of helping a president conduct a war across 2 administrations. The question after this is really going to be more, we'll begin boring in on Afghanistan.
Sure.
Could you just talk a bit about the differences between Obama and Bush as war presidents?
Yeah, so this won't be scientific because the 2 settings were very different. I mean, I joined the Bush administration in the last 18 months of an 8-year administration, right? So at that point, in the last 18 months, the National Security Council, the staffing was set, the team was set, everyone knew everyone else. Processes were well practiced, and it was a very highly functioning team. Of course, on the afternoon of January 20th, Obama becomes president, and none of those conditions persist. So it's a brand new team. Only a few people at that point had been confirmed. A couple secretaries, I think, had been confirmed. Bob Gates was an element of continuity because he had been the Secretary of Defense under Bush, and Obama asked him to stay. But there was little continuity. And it's actually a very strange way to change command, if you will. And most, very few corporate organizations or military organizations and many other governments would refute this model, where you have this kind of clean sweep at the top at the time of handover from one president to the other. I found most of my observations differentiating Bush and Obama have to do with that setting, right? The setting that we have one experienced president, established team, established processes, and on the other hand, just the opposite. Personally, I found much more continuity than I think is publicly reported. President Bush, I think, was more, by way of style, was more instinctual, tended to go with his gut instinct, but it was an informed instinct. I think gets too little credit for being well-read and immersed in the details. He was immersed in the details. And I know this from 18 months, 6 days a week of briefing him every morning. He knew Iraq, and I think to a lesser extent Afghanistan, but he certainly knew Iraq in a way that I think empowered his presidency. President Obama is studious. He's careful. He's very deliberate in his decision making, and it's based on evidence. It's based, it's an analytic approach, less instinctual. But in many ways, I think they both featured very desirable traits at the senior executive role.
Okay, so let's now finally get to Afghanistan. Again, urge people to put questions in the Q&A. I think I'll just frame it as a question. Is it fair to say that you were pretty pessimistic about our chances in Afghanistan all along? Or did your views change?
Well, no, I was always pretty skeptical, based, frankly, on those exposures with John Abbasade in 04, 06. So even before this sort of resurgence of the Taliban, repeat visits, basically once a month for 2 years to Afghanistan, signaled to me that we had to be careful about calibrating what we wanted to achieve. So our goals or our ends, right, in sort of Clausewitzian terms, because the setting in Afghanistan was such that the poverty, the illiteracy, the very rural nature of much of the country, rural, isolated nature of much of the country, the history. You know, when we went to Afghanistan in 2001, they'd already been at war, nonstop war for something like 20 years, right? Dating all the way back to the Soviet intervention in '79. So I think I believe I had a bit of that texture that we talked about earlier, that this was going to be a really hard project unless we very narrowly defined what we were out to achieve. And by '04 and '06, by the time, while the Taliban was still somewhat dormant, we gradually, in the American government, allowed our goals to expand and become quite ambitious. So I remember when, by '07, when I go to the White House, I asked for, look, can somebody just give me the statement of our objective in Afghanistan? And it's one of these terrible government phrases, you know, it's got like 4 clauses with separated by semicolons. It's impossible. You could never diagram the sentence, right? But one of the clauses was a vibrant market economy, you know, that we were going to achieve a vibrant market economy in Afghanistan. And when I asked my staffer, you know, what did we have in mind here? You know, she sort of admitted, well, the only element of vibrant market economy these days is the, you know, illegal drug trade. So when you add up the history, the demographics, the geography of Afghanistan, anything beyond rather narrow goals. So in particular, goals that addressed our vital national interest, which was counterterrorism, right? Anything much beyond that edged on becoming unrealistic, in my view. So from '04, '06, all the way until I left government in '17, I was generally skeptical, routinely skeptical about being too ambitious in Afghanistan. And I think over time, what we've actually seen is after an expansion of our goals, at the time when the Taliban was relatively quiet, so I would say up until '06, from '06 to today, what we see is generally a pattern of narrowing of our objectives, so that eventually we get to the point, and we can argue exactly where the break point was, but we get to a point where our objectives are narrowed and they then meet the resources. They align with the resources we're willing to commit, all the way up to the point where several weeks ago, the president decided we would commit no more military resources in Afghanistan proper.
Were you in favor of that decision?
I am. I think it's the right decision.
Could you? I'd like you to say more, particularly, and then you know all the counter arguments. So maybe, including by people like our mutual friend Dave Petraeus.
Sure.
What are the counter arguments? Why don't you buy them?
Well,
first, why was it right? And then what are the counter arguments and why don't they work?
Right. I think it was right because first of all, even with the level of commitment of military troops that we had the day before the decision, right? So roughly 2,500 to 3,500 troops, largely focused on counterterrorism and to a much lesser extent, assistance and training to the Afghan security forces, right? Those are really the two missions of this small force. I mean, 2,500 troops is quite small. Even with that force, what we were witnessing was a slowly eroding stalemate in the security situation. The Taliban were making reasonably steady gains, especially in the more remote, obviously Pashtun populated areas. So districts that we had fought over during the Obama surge. So think northern Helmand or Uruzgan province, elements or areas around Kandahar city in the south, were increasingly falling under Taliban control. I think this demonstrated that the Afghan National Security Forces, while much more capable than when we started, were insufficient to sort of defeat the Taliban in a classic military sense. This, of course, should have been obvious to us because we were unable to defeat the Taliban in a classic military sense, even when we had 100,000 Americans and an additional 40,000 NATO allies and partners with us in sort of the surge years of Obama, so 2010, 2011. So this slowly eroding stalemate was going to take us over time, and it might have been a year, it might have been 2 years, to a point where the 2,500 American troops were still there, but were increasingly under siege and unable to really assert leverage on the diplomatic process. The other thing that is compelling for me is that for the first time over the last year or so, for the first time in the long history, the 20-year history of American presence in Afghanistan, we had achieved what we long said we needed, which was a diplomatic approach, not yet productive, right, or effective, but a diplomatic setting where the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban were in a room, in Doha, Qatar as it is, talking about the future of Afghanistan. So I think we gradually appreciated that the military approach could only take us so far and was not going to produce a battlefield solution, and that the approach here had to revert to at least the potential, at least exploring the potential of a diplomatic approach. And so I thought, based on the agreement made under President Trump with Zalmay Khalilzad at the table for the US, the agreement that US troops would withdraw by 1 May, and that was part and parcel of this emerging diplomatic approach in Doha, that for us to refute the 1 May deadline and back away from it would simply leave us stuck with this slowly eroding stalemate on the ground in Afghanistan, and essentially lead us nowhere. So I thought the decision to abide by 1 May, as it turns out, 1 May with a several month extension, but I think the extension is really not that key. I thought that move, coupled with a number of other moves that were announced but got much less attention in the Biden decision, right? They presented a package that at least gives us the chance to pursue a diplomatic option. Now, what are those other elements? And they're important, and they get too little attention. So one is to sustain economic assistance and security assistance. In other words, continue to pay for the Army and the Afghan Army and police to be in the field. Right now, we pay about $4 billion a year in salaries and fuel and resources and ammunition and so forth to keep the Afghans in the field fighting the Taliban. That needs to be sustained. Sustain our diplomatic effort in Doha, centered in Doha. But Biden also announced a broadening of that diplomatic effort with the announcement that UN Secretary General Guterres would name, and he has named, Jean Arnaud as a special representative and envoy focused on this. So put some of the diplomatic weight here on the shoulders of the UN. I always believed that the US attempt, as one of the protagonists in the conflict, any US attempt to broker a diplomatic solution between Afghans and Afghans was going to be weighted and distorted in a way that would be unproductive, because we were a protagonist. We were not a neutral mediator. We never could be. He also announced a regional approach, which put, I thought, more burden on those most closely affected by the Afghan conflict. So Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asian states, and so forth. And then finally, he directed the Pentagon to do something that the Pentagon has resisted for years, which is to imagine doing counterterrorism in service of our key vital national interests in Afghanistan, right? So keeping Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, the branch of the Islamic State, under wraps, or at least suppress those terrorist targets. He directed the top of the Pentagon to get creative and to look to how it might do that sufficiently from outside Afghanistan. Now, typically in this last point, this becomes the great debating point that, well, we're sacrificing our vital national interests. We can't do CT as well from over the horizon as we can from on the ground. I accept that. We can't. But can we do it sufficiently well? And I believe, given our advances in the last 20 years in counterterrorism, so here most prominently the strike capabilities on the ground of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, our much improved ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, our precision strike from over the horizon, a huge air base in outside Doha, Qatar, and potentially bases closer to Afghanistan in the neighborhood, that those combine to suggest, to promise that we could actually do sufficient CT from over the horizon. So it's a combination of all those factors, Elliot, that centered largely on, if there is no military solution, if we accept that there's no outright military solution in this fight, then what is the solution? And I've come to believe, especially in the last 10 years, that that is a solution around the table where Afghans are talking to Afghans about the future of Afghanistan. And we should put everything we have, all our chips, in support of that effort, even though to date, it has not been effective, it's not been productive. So it's a complicated multivariable equation.
Sure. So now the counter, let's just to, I am going to get to the Q&A, although part of what I'm now asking is in the Q&A.
Sure.
I think most observers would say, look, there really isn't going to be a diplomatic solution. The civil war is going to continue. Why would the Taliban ease up? And so what one should, the realistic expectation, yes, one invests in the diplomatic effort. The realistic expectation is the Taliban takes the country back. I mean, isn't that the most realistic prediction? And so our success would then have to rest. Then there are two issues. One is our success would have to rest on the notion that the Taliban will keep Al-Qaeda and ISIS under control because they don't want to get schwacked again by the Americans. Mm-hmm. And we're willing to live with what will be the human misery of a Taliban takeover, with everything it means for women, with everything that it means for people who've worked with us, which is a serious human and moral cost. So yeah. How would you respond to those?
Well, so I don't think it's inevitable that the Taliban resume control or reassume control over all the country. I mean, I think the government has sufficient security resources to secure the major population centers. So here, think of, Kabul, Jalalabad to the east, Mazar and surrounding areas in the north, Herat in the west, and Kandahar in the south. I think those major cities can be secured. Now, not secured perfectly. I mean, we saw just last week a horrific bombing of an area, of a school, a girls' school outside of Kabul that resulted in, tens of casualties, tens of fatalities. So this isn't going to be perfect, but we should remember that the pressure on these population centers was happening with our presence there or not. So this part of the symptoms of the slowly eroding security situation that I described earlier. The Taliban, I think, will somewhat naturally assert increased control in the rural Pashtun areas. They just will. Why? Because they are rural Pashtuns. I mean, most Taliban fighters walk to war. They fight within 10 kilometers of their home village. So this is a very rural, grassroots-based insurgency in those rural Pashtun areas. Furthermore, the central government provides little into those areas. And if anything, is seen as an oppressor because of corrupt taxing checkpoints on the highways and so forth by government forces. So you have this sort of natural rise of influence and gradual expansion of Taliban control in these rural areas. I don't believe that inevitably leads to assault on the cities. And I think if the Afghan security forces are focused on the population centers, that Kabul, for example, won't be a pleasant place to live, but doesn't have to live under Taliban rule. So I don't think it's that grim. I also think that we still have some leverage. I mean, those who say, well, the 2,500 troops were the last bit of leverage, U.S. leverage on the Taliban. I think we still have some leverage. The Taliban, or the Afghan government holds something like 5,000 Taliban prisoners. They want them back. The Taliban leaders are still under UN travel and finance sanctions. They can't travel freely. They want that removed. The Taliban, and I met with the Taliban about 2 years ago, before Zal was appointed as envoy, went with a non-governmental organization, went to Doha and met with the Taliban. They, I think, learned something, and this would have to be proven and tested, right? But I think they learned something from the 2001 experience, where they did harbor Al-Qaeda leaders. And they learned that being an international pariah state isn't all that it's cracked up to be. it's not such a great life. So we have leverage in the sense that they want to be recognized as part of a government. Now, how much of a part is the debating point, right? That's the debating space. What role do they play in a recast power sharing arrangement with the Afghan government? But I don't think that they aim for a repeat of 2001. And they know that absent international economic support, that what they would inherit is a failed state. And that's not their image of the future of Afghanistan. So
could you say something more about that? I mean, what is their, what do you think is their image of the future of Afghanistan?
Well, for sure, they expect to reassert control and essentially rule in these rural Pashtun areas, their home base. How much they believe in power sharing, and power sharing, as you and I might discuss it,
I can't imagine that they do.
We simply don't know, right? Because they have not put forth in Doha a model for what power sharing might look like for them. They've held those cards very close to the vest. And they may not believe in it at all. I believe, however, that given the conditions inside Afghanistan, given our ability to do sufficient counterterrorism from outside Afghanistan, and given a very important factor, given the role of the region, in particular Pakistan, under this new dynamic. I mean, this is now the next phase of the Afghan war, right? The war is not really ending. I mean, maybe it's ending for our soldiers, but it's not really ending in Afghanistan. In this next phase, absent a US military presence, that the prospect for the neighbors, in particular for Pakistan, that if they don't assert themselves in this fight in a productive way, in particular by way of pressing the Taliban, then they face the potential of chaos on their western border. I can't imagine that Pakistan wants the Taliban in power in Afghanistan, especially with the still smoldering embers of the Pakistani Taliban in the frontier areas of Pakistan itself. So in my view, the role of Pakistan hinges on this Pakistani two key interests. First of all, Pakistan does not want an outsized Indian influence in Afghanistan next door, because that would give Pakistan sort of a two-front problem, right? Both east and west. But they also want to be very careful not to do anything that would empower an alignment between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban. Because if that were the case, the Pashtun region, which spans that border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, would be hostile to the central government in Pakistan. So I think there's a role here there's an increased role for Pakistan now confronting, there's no US backstop. There's no US military backstop now in Afghanistan. How exactly does Pakistan react to that? And I think that's a dynamic that's worth exploring.
So I'm to those of you who've been putting questions in the Q&A, I'm paying attention to them, and I'm trying to kind of working them into the conversation.
This is why you're the dean.
I am trying to work them into the conversation. Let me so first turn to some American policy questions, and then go back to your assessment of the region overall. I think one of the things that's been most painful for a lot of well, let me say what I think people who are not in favor of it, and to be clear, I'm actually agnostic. I don't know, because I see the force of your arguments. I see the force of the arguments on the other side. But in any case, I'm not able to influence the decision, so it really doesn't make a difference. But it seems to me there are three different sets of concerns. So one are these sort of geopolitical concerns, the concerns about Al-Qaeda, some extent about reputation and so on, but that's one set, and we've explored those. I think a second set is the second and third sets are much more humanitarian in nature. One is, okay, what are we going to do with the people who've been by our side, the interpreters,
right,
and so on,
right,
who are now going to be exposed and certainly believe they're going to be exposed. But then the third is really much broader, and that I think many people are very seized of the fact that, look, you had children getting real educations for a long time. Status of women, while still, in some ways pretty terrible by our standards, is a world away from what it was in, say, the year 2000. How do we think about those latter two issues in particular? Those are the people who've been with us,
right,
and women and children.
Well, first of all, I think we should accept that we have a responsibility on both of those fronts. And I think the key element here is that in this, now the president's made a decision, right? And what you and I think, learned together in the Bush administration is that even after the president takes a decision, the delivery of that decision is the difficult part, the implementation phase, the execution phase. So we're now in the implementation phase of the presidential decision taken several weeks ago. The ability of the US government to pull this off will be, I think, is in question. So first of all, the Biden team at the undersecretary and assistant secretary level is still forming. Many unconfirmed assistant secretaries. Look, undersecretaries and assistant secretaries are the ones who implement. Okay, so there's a whole series of difficult implementation challenges that were essentially embedded in the president's speech. So one is we've talked about over-the-horizon counterterrorism. So the Pentagon's got work to do, right? Okay. We've talked about continuing economic and security assistance. Those are State Department accounts with the Congress. That's work to do, right? I think we have a responsibility, as your second challenge suggested, to those Afghans who have stood alongside of us with the promise that we will stand with them. So by way of the special immigration visas and so forth, there's a program to allow thousands of Afghans to expedite the arrival into the United States, immigration visas under this program. And that program has under-delivered for years, just as it did, by the way, as we departed Iraq. So that's an execution problem. I mean, the authorities are in place, the money's in place, and that's an execution problem, which has under-delivered. So we've got to get smart on that. There's a large diplomatic effort, not only the obvious one in support of Doha, but the regional diplomacy, the support of this new role in the UN. Coming out of NATO, for example, I imagine that NATO could be part of the implementation team, right? So what if NATO, for example, were the clearinghouse for all international security assistance flowing into Afghanistan? Because NATO's got skin in the game here. This was the only time NATO is the largest and longest ever combat operation by NATO, a long way from NATO territory, by the way, in Afghanistan. So maybe there's an implementation task for NATO. But my concern, to both of your points, right, is that if we're not careful, as Americans tend to do, we will pay insufficient attention to the execution of this presidential decision. And it's not perhaps that the decision is wrong, but we will get wrong the execution. And we will see things that didn't have to happen, largely because we're not paying attention or we're not organized properly. And it was actually, at the end of the Bush administration, it was our effort as an interagency team to get past that execution challenge in Iraq in particular. But as we both know, it's very, very hard. Because after a presidential decision, at the top of the US government, they move on to the next decision. And there's almost this assumption that execution will just happen. I mean, the president addressed the nation. So if the president says it will happen, it will happen. And actually, my observation, if I ever write this book, one of my key observations is that's exactly wrong. The president's taking the decision to speak to the nation is only step one And it is, frankly, the easy part. The tough part is the months that follows, and all these interconnected, interrelated execution projects. So if I were in the government today, I would ask the Biden administration, who's in charge of this? And if the assumption is simply that this is going to happen, state's going to do its work, defense is going to do its work, it's all going to come together neatly in some sort of package, and things won't be so bad in Afghanistan, then we should buckle up, because things are going to be very bad. We need to have an execution program across agencies and departments that actually assures that this has got a chance. Otherwise, in my view, it has no chance.
Yeah, if one of the many things you taught me in government is the centrality of the implementation, which is not something that as academics we focus on. We usually prefer to focus on the kind of the big strategic decisions. I mean, those are the kinds that are a lot easier to write papers about. I think you once described, I remember you describing yourself as the company first sergeant of the interagency process. And for those of you who don't have military backgrounds, the company first sergeant is the one who goes around, checking to make sure that the privates actually have their canteens filled with water and,
Right.
The right supplies and so on. And
things happen at the right time in the right place. Yeah.
It really, really is central. Well, let's go. You didn't on that broader question of things like status of women, education, and so on. Are we going to have to just say it's too bad we gave it our best shot, and
No, I don't think so.
Those gains will not be sustained?
Yeah. So if my forecast proves right, that the major population centers will still be under pressure, security pressure, but will not fall to the Taliban. I think what you'll see is that, as it is the case today, that the schools and the women's programs and the non-governmental organizations, the healthcare being provided, will increasingly gravitate to those population centers. In the rural areas, to some extent, the Taliban has recently allowed, although to a lesser extent, some of these programs to continue, to include, for example, the flow of healthcare. But we shouldn't count on that. My sense is increasingly we're going to need to revert to a large cities program. Now, Afghanistan's got a bit of history here, right? The large city regional program suggests the warlord approach, right? Which is how Afghanistan's been governed at times in the past. I think, frankly, given the limited reach of the central government, that we will revert to regional power brokers to an increasing extent. And there's some who would argue that we made a mistake after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, 2002, and that we should have gone with the flow. We should swim with the current in Afghanistan. And the current
go with the grain.
With the grain, not against the grain, right? Don't swim upstream, to mix our metaphors, right? But these power brokers still exist. So if you go to Jalalabad, Gul Aga Shirzai is there, Muhammad Atta up in Mazar, Ismail Khan in Herat. So I think that those power brokers, who are the natural centers of political and security power, will rise in influence. But their livelihood and their families and their followers all depend on their pressing back against the Taliban. None of them is willing to surrender to the Taliban. So part of my confidence in the years forward in Afghanistan is that, look, there is sort of a shadow security mechanism in Afghanistan, and in those shadows stand these power brokers. And by the way, most of these guys they're very shadowy. They deserve to be.
Yes, I remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
But again, it's swimming with the current, right? As opposed to imagining that we're going to re-engineer the flow of this river to our design.
Well, I always try to give people 5 minutes at the end in case they got to run to a 10 o'clock meeting of some kind. So I'm very reluctantly going to bring this to a close. We could talk a lot more about this. You have to write the book. I'd like you to write the book at SAIS. But this has been terrific, Doug, as always. Thanks ever so
Thanks,
much.
Elliot. Yeah,
Really
thanks.
appreciate it.
Thanks to you and to the audience and your team who administer these things.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Well.